I'm here today with Satyajit, the author of many textbooks on derivative securities. Today we're here to talk about his history of derivatives, financial development, financial innovation, and the mess that it led us into. The book is called Extreme Money, Masters of the Universe and the Cult of Risk. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to be with you.
So you've written a book following a career in the derivatives business, following being perhaps the leading writer of textbooks in the world on derivatives, and following what you might call a mess that perhaps has not even been cleaned up yet. Let's talk about the book, what inspired you to write it, and the various dimensions of the challenge that, are before us today and tomorrow.
Well, I think the first thing I would say is, looking back on it, I started work on the 7th of March, 1977, which is over 34 years ago. And I started in a commercial bank doing what commercial bankers do, which is basically lending money. And I stumbled into the world of derivatives because it seemed a little bit more interesting than lending money. And that was when it wasn't even derivatives, it was futures and options and things like that. And now that I look back on these 34 years, it was almost as if I'd walked in the store on the day it was opening. And the whole world of financialization, of the new finance, if you like, of high finance was being born. And so I wanted to set down not an external person's view, not an academic view, but somebody who's worked in the industry for this 34 years and looked at it from every possible direction, which is worked in a commercial bank, worked in an investment bank, worked in a corporate treasury, worked with central bankers, investors, hedge funds, and so forth as a consultant. I wanted to try to give people an idea, both at a theoretical level, at a practical level, at a cultural level, of what it was like, this period of history was, and use that to try to elucidate, as you call the mess we are now in, how we got there. Because the impression everybody gets is somehow mysteriously there was a bit of mortgage lending which went sour in the 2000s, which led to this problem. But my thesis is it wasn't that. It was a process which started a long, long time ago, and gradually, through no particular plan of anybody's, there was a series of events which set us off down this path. And the interesting thing is now to examine what happened, why it happened, those accidents, and the choices we make, and what new choices we have to make now.
Let's talk about economic and financial theory. How did economic and financial theory, which you might say, foment the development of what we'll call the doomsday machine? And where were the points or times in this history and in your own life where you started to suspect that theory wasn't telling you the whole story?
Well, it goes back to really Markowitz, but then you had Samuelson, you had people like Bill Sharp, and eventually, obviously, what I call the three gods, which is Myron Scholes, Robert Merton, and the late Fisher Black. But I think the most interesting thing is all their work was done well and truly before this stuff started. And I think what happened was the financial services industry developed not in a theoretical to practical sense, but it developed because of a failing of, I suppose, existing economic orthodoxy, because that hadn't worked. And I think everybody puts it down to a theoretical shift. It wasn't. It was more about what we are doing is not working, what do we need to now do? And to some extent, we attached ourselves to the theory. I mean, politicians, practitioners like to basically believe there's a liturgy, a holy Aramaic or mathematical liturgy, which sort of justifies what we do. And so they developed an attachment ex post to the theory. And in the initial phase, I think we rather blindly followed the theory to some degree. But gradually, because the markets weren't well developed, we were innovating and there were all sorts of problems around us, we started to see the problems, the assumptions, how they break down. But I noticed something really strange occurred, which was really around the late 80s, probably early 90s. All of us who had grown up in what I call the hard knock school of banking, where we'd learned as we went along, were replaced quite progressively by people who came trained, what I would call almost ready-to-be derivative traders or ready-to-be bankers, because they were not coming off a production line of MBAs or business studies or masters in science in financial engineering were starting to roll out. But they actually came and took this pretty much as almost the Ten Commandments. They read the Ten Commandments and said, thou shalt, use black shells, thou shalt put volatility in, and thou shalt do that. And we used to look at them and going, are these guys completely insane? But gradually that took over. We moved on and did other things, but gradually that took over. So the first thing I would say is it was more practice with the theory being fitted around it. Mm-hmm. And frankly, it was impossible to go to your boss and say, why did you do this? Well, we did this because A, the client wanted to do this, and B, then we had to hedge it, and B, it felt like a good idea at the time. And they would say, are you guys all insane? You're making these huge bets based on this. So we had to have a nice theoretical framework. We had value at risk models with nice little tails, and we'd show them, and I used to specialize in doing 3D graphs.
Is that tails spelled T-A-L-E-S?
Oh, well, it was mostly tails, T-A-L-E-S, but we called them tails. But I used to love doing 3D graphs with these gamma graphs and so forth going everywhere, and I used to give it to senior managers, and who would look at it and go, very interesting. And I knew they hadn't understood the slightest bit about it. Frankly, it would be hard-pressed to explain some of those graphs. They looked very pretty. So I think the understanding that people have of this theoretical framework, which is very rigorous, is a stretch.
But in those more tranquil or good times, it was making money.
You're
so nobody
absolutely
wants to
right.
look under the hood because there's nothing knocking in the engine.
You know how I found out about gamma? I made a mistake in my hedge, but the profit margins were so large, I could still cover my mistake and make money. Now today, because the margins are much tighter, you can't do that. And so we learned by making mistakes, but there was toleration. In other words, to go back to the jargon, the risk was much better priced than it became in time. So I think you're absolutely right. It was about effectively how you sort of massage the numbers and make money. And that changed dramatically by the time you got to the early 1990s.